Big thanks, Lindsay, Melissa, Leah, and Jacob. Huge thanks for that telling discussion of not only the importance but the relevance of the Endangered Species Act and the work that we do, and the importance of science. Let me say it again, the importance of science in decision-making in policy world. Now I'm really pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker, Congressman Don Beyer, who is serving his 5th term representing Virginia's 8th District. A longtime ally and a steadfast hero for wildlife and our climate, Congressman Beyer is co-chair of the House ESA caucus and serves on the all-important House Appropriations Committee. During a moving floor speech recently, Congressman Beyer lambasted House leadership, as only he can do, for pushing proposals to strip ESA protections from critically imperiled species like the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat, while he also eloquently pointed out how detached those partisan attacks are from the needs and priorities of the American public. Congressman, we can't thank you enough for your tireless and loyal support for the Endangered Species Act and for efforts to tackle the biodiversity and climate crisis in tireless, unapologetic, and forceful fashion. Everyone, please join me in welcoming to the podium Congressman Don Beyer.
Good afternoon. Well, welcome to Congress, I think. The next 3 weeks are going to be pretty wild and crazy. This is the wonderful way, though, for me to come back after a too long break. And Jamie, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful working with you and with your team. You know, we have this darling little dog at home who's very smart and very sweet and has not bitten anybody. And I only bring him up because the bumper sticker finally fell off my car that said, "If you love your dog, thank a wolf." And as co-chair of the Congressional Endangered Species Act Caucus, it's my pleasure to just be here to congratulate you on 50 years of success of the Endangered Species Act. And I am excited to announce that in the coming weeks, along with the other leaders of the ESA caucus, we will introduce a resolution commemorating this 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, which I hope will actually pass. As many of you are keenly aware, our planet is now experiencing a biodiversity crisis of epic proportions for many, many, many different reasons, as I'm sure you've talked about for the last 2 hours. But because of that, the ESA has never been more important, and never has it been as important for us to celebrate the extraordinary success it's had over the last 50 years. You know, 99%, I'm sure it's come up again and again this afternoon, of the species listed have been protected, have not gone extinct. Earlier this year, there was a study that found that 40% of the animals and 34% of the plants in the United States, not worldwide, are at the risk of extinction, and that 41% of the ecosystems are facing collapse. The health of wildlife and ecosystems is directly related to our health, to human health, because healthy ecosystems support clean water, clean air, pollination, absence of pollution, and I could go on and on. Unfortunately, despite the best available science, some of my colleagues in Congress have been deaf to the latest science and have launched an unprecedented attack to undermine the Endangered Species Act, our nation's most effective tool for preventing extinction. So despite the 50 years of success, we have seen a staggering 38 pieces of legislation to undermine the Endangered Species Act just this year, 28 in the House and 10 in the Senate. That's more than one every week. And these attacks include things like removing or blocking protections for individual species, depriving them of protections of the ESA. The targets include iconic species, the charismatics like the gray wolf and the grizzly bear, and those that most of us may not have heard of before, you know, the dune sagebrush lizard, but just as important for our overall eco-health. And there are other more extensive pieces of legislation that would provide broad exemptions or otherwise undermine the framework of the Endangered Species Act. So in addition to the long list of bills, which Jamie and many of the leaders here have been paying attention to on a day-by-day basis, that deny protections to individual species, The Congressional Western Caucus, which exists, and the House Natural Resources Republican Committee majority, together they recently announced a plan to advance a wholesale rewrite of the ESA. I don't mind telling you, a wholesale rewrite would mean basically to weaken virtually every provision within it. These sponsors have left no stone unturned in the use of launching any vehicle at hand to undermine the ESA. Standalone legislation to amendments, riders on must-pass bills, additions to the Defense Authorization Act, attacks to appropriations bills, and probably most relevant to us, the disapproval of administrative rulemaking using the Congressional Review Act. Congressional Review Act basically was created to keep administrations passing rules as they go out the door that would then rule for years to come. And you basically, the Congress has 100 business days to overturn any rule that the executive branch has passed. Well, right now, the Republican majority in the House is using that to overturn rules passed by the Biden administration. The use of the ERA to dismantle the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, is like an alarming new way to attack the Endangered Species Act, to attack biodiversity, and to attack the recommendations of the scientific community. By the way, when the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, overturns a rule, it includes the phrase prohibiting, quote, substantially the same. Just because you have tried to protect a given species, and then the Congressional Review Act overturns that, that means that the Fish and Wildlife and Department of Interior can't use substantially the same for that same species. Basically, it takes it off the hook forever. So these nullifying rules for listing or uplisting species are particularly dangerous and unprecedented. So basically, a vote to approve a resolution like this is potentially a vote to condemn a species to extinction, because the agency wouldn't be able to act until Congress actually passed legislation saying otherwise for that specific species. No, Fish and Wildlife, the scientists would be out of it. In fact, the last two votes we took on the House floor before this long 7-week recess weren't measures to fund the government. They weren't measures to pass any of the appropriations bills or deal with any of the crises we have, or the shutdown, avoid the shutdown. Instead, the last two were Congressional Review Acts for the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat. Tells you where we are in terms of the priorities of Congress. It's astonishing and it's deeply troubling. And I at least am thrilled that President Biden has promised to veto both of those if they ever make it to his desk. We shouldn't be legislating science. When passing the Endangered Species Act, Congress wisely and overwhelmingly passed it, but they did it with bipartisan support. Debbie Dingell, co-chairs with me the caucus. It was her husband that led it all those years ago. And it was a law that gave agency the decision-making authority and tasked the experts to make listing judgments based on sound science, with public input, with opportunity for judicial review. Among the attacks that we've seen again and again is no lawsuits. You just can't ever challenge the decision made in court. And rather than dismantling our bedrock conservation legislation, we need to do much, much more to fund the Endangered Species Act, because the truth is the ESA is starved, not broken. We could do so much more if we had the money within the Department of Interior to do this. Hundreds of species receive little or no funding for recovery. We may list it, but that's it. And the ESA isn't able to intervene as quickly and expansively as is necessary for these listings. For a bunch of years, along with Representative Raul Grijalva, who chairs the Natural Resources Committee when the Democrats are in charge, ranking member now, and Debbie Dingell, we've led, with more than 100 members, letters to the Appropriations Committee asking for full funding for the Endangered Species Act so that our country can adequately address the biodiversity crisis and the tragedy of extinction. And despite the serious and misguided political challenges, there's still reason for hope. In Congress, the anti-wildlife members of Congress have waged a lot of attacks, but so far they've all been unsuccessful, because we can always find a number of moderate Republicans serving in districts that Joe Biden won in 2020, who will vote with us. And just decades of polling have shown broad bipartisan support. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, 4 out of 5 Americans in favor of the Endangered Species Act. And as long as the public doesn't grow complacent, I'm confident that we can successfully thwart these wildlife attacks again in Congress. But we've got to be as vocal as we possibly can. I had the being in Congress gives you so many wonderful learning opportunities. So I got a chance to meet with Ed Wilson a number of times, E.O. Wilson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on biodiversity. He was the guy who originally articulated all the reasons why biodiversity is so very, very important. And for 8 years, with Jamie's help, we've been trying to pass the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act to create wildlife corridors for all those species that are basically islands that can't breed with each other because there's a highway, a tunnel, a bridge in between. But it is pretty cool. When you look at the states that have actually spent money on wildlife crossings, corridors, the animals find them right away. They're smart. They know exactly how to do it. There's a wonderful, I've done 1,982 miles on the Appalachian Trail so far. And you go out there on any snowy morning, you'll find that the trail is being used by all the other animals too. And there's a wonderful story at the north end of the Great Smoky Mountain Park, where the Appalachian Trail crosses the Pigeon River and gets out of the trail. There's a little place at the bottom called Mama's Hamburger Shop or something like that, where everybody comes off the trail and eats. And they will tell you that in the 2 weeks before hunting season starts in October, you can watch the bears come down to the mountains to the north, cross the little bridge, the highway bridge, to come into the park day after day, bears, because they're smart and they understand it when we create those corridors. But every week, we discover a new medicine to fight cancer or to quell anxiety or restore hearing, all from biological sources. And if we get rid of that biodiversity, the ability to change our health goes away. Yes, I don't know the exact number, maybe Jamie does, how many species are on this planet, tens of millions probably, and many go extinct every day and many are created every day. But the loss of the big important ones is devastating to our culture. Most of our time here is spent on bears and wolves. And just imagine what our literature would be like, our stories, our dreams, without wolves. The most classic pieces of our literature, Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all the fairy tales, prominently feature wolves. And bears, men and women and bears and wolves co-evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and how poor we would be without these animals in our lives. And it's only because of the Endangered Species Act that we even have grizzly bears and gray wolves in our country right now. So I thought I'd come over and talk to 15 people. I am thrilled to see how a room full of people who care so much about biodiversity, about the species that are endangered. I'm sure you've all read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, Germs, Guns, and Steel, whatever. But his description of how every time mankind got to a new place on the planet, the first thing we did was kill all the big animals and all the predators and the like. We are finally at the point in human history where evolution is self-aware, where we realize what our history has done, and therefore have the responsibility to change it and to turn it back and to take responsibility for all life on this amazing planet. And thank you for being the leaders that actually will make that happen. Thanks so much.